This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we're going to take a look at transactions. And what a transaction allows us to do is it allows us to treat a group of action queries, as they're terming it, but those are more in line with insert, update, and delete activities, as one unit of work. If we start a transaction, we get to decide whether we're going to roll them back or commit them based off of the results of our processing. In the case where we're just doing inserts, updates, and deletes, and we're not utilizing a transaction, things are going to be committed to the database, and we may end up processing a few updates, a few inserts, and then we get to the point that we're trying to do some type of a delete, and the whole thing goes south and we throw an exception. That means that we have some things that have been applied to the database, other things that haven't. We're not really in a clean state, and it usually takes a lot of time and effort to try to figure out how to get the data back to a consistent state. Other things that Murach is giving us guidance towards is when you code two or more action queries that affect related data, when you update foreign key references, when you move data from one table to another table, when you code a select query followed by an action query and the values inserted in the action query are based on the result of the select query, and when a failure of any set of SQL statements would violate data integrity. So that means anytime you're doing any update type activity, more than one statement, you're always going to want to use some type of a transaction to make sure that things can be rolled back or committed based on whether things are successful and everything went well, or if there's some type of an exception that's thrown, you want to make sure that you're rolling everything back like it never happened. We also have the begin transaction or begin tran. I like to use the begin transaction, even though begin tran is less. I can use begin transaction in Oracle, and I can use commit transaction and rollback transaction. So I like to use the one that I can be more consistent across the databases. We also have the save transaction with a save point. Quite frankly, I don't think I've ever used one. Most everything that I've done within industry has been such that I can either use a transaction and roll everything back or apply everything. One of the two cases. Usually with a save point, you're going to essentially save certain things at certain points. You would have to have a specific use case that it's okay that you would roll something back but commit most everything in order to do that type of processing. We can also embed transactions within other transactions within our stored procedures as well. Typically, I don't necessarily see the value in doing that, but you can do that as well. Here is an example of the save point. You're essentially going to begin the transaction, and then you can save the transaction save point. You have to give it a name. In this case, the first save point is vendor 1. The second save point is vendor 2. Then they're rolling back the transaction from vendor 2 save point. Then it's going to go back to the 1. And then if you roll back vendor 1, and then you can go ahead and commit transaction. Essentially, this is going to end up with you've rolled back two things and applied one thing because you're doing a couple different deletes there. Again, you would have to have a specific use case for this in order to try to work on that. Now we're going to take a look at concurrency problems in the next video. Here we want to kind of focus in on how we can create a transaction, and I've gone ahead and I've written some program code because we're going to treat this as, let me get my cursor so I can move this down a little bit here, okay? We're going to treat this like we're developing an application, and we want to essentially process a transaction from program code and then a transaction in a different case from the procedure itself. Now, it's not usually a good idea to mix the two. You would think that it just is going to happen like the embedded transactions, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily work so slick, and it doesn't work exactly as you think it's going to work, and therefore I would recommend to either do it on the program side or do it in the database and not necessarily mix them up too much. If we look at this case, so I have two procedures. I have a lot of procedures actually because I like to write code, but one's going to be inserting the employee territory and inserting the employee. So this is going to be where I'm doing two separate inserts, and I'm going to do these within a transaction in the program code. Then I have a combined procedure that is going to essentially do the exact same thing. It's going to do those insert statements. And yeah, I could have done an execute call, but I just copied and pasted code. Easy enough when I was doing this. Typically, I wouldn't do that, but you wouldn't code both of these types of things. But this is going to be an insert employee and territory. We are going to be doing this within the transaction from the database using the procedure to do that. We have the commit here. So if it's successful, if it can process both inserts, it's going to commit the transaction. If it's not successful, then it's going to roll back the transaction, but we still want to throw an exception message up because we have our application here and it's a lovely front end. Mind you, I'm not a front end coder, I'm more of a server side coder. But for our Northwinds, it's essentially going to be dealing with our employees and our employee territories. And it's going to allow us to insert an employee and an employee territory, or we're just going to show all of the employees. We have quite a few fields here on this table that are hidden. We have the territory ID down here that's hidden, but this would be the thing that we would try to aim to write the code to be able to connect to this application. Now, if we go switch over to the program code itself, we can kind of take a peek at what the stored procedures would look like, and this is going to be Java programming code. So I'm going to switch first to the connection factory. I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger here. And the connection factory is going to be how we're essentially giving it the driver and trying to create the connection itself. And yes, this is my hard-coded URL for my Docker installation that we're trying to connect to the SQL Server database. You would never do this in real production code, but this is just quick and dirty because we're trying to illustrate concepts, not necessarily try to learn how to write the actual production code to do this. We also have the database connection, and one of the things to note here is we have some methods. This is going to be inherited by other classes, and we have the connect method that's going to get that connection factory instance. Then we also have the close for that connection. We have the start transaction. And one of the things that we'll look at later is where we can set the transaction isolation level. And here we can do that using our JDBC connection for SQL Server with setting that. And right now I have it set to a repeatable read, and we'll look at those levels in the next video. Note that the set auto commit is false. That means that it is not going to automatically commit anything that we do to the database. We have our commit that's then going to go ahead and commit it. And we have a rollback that's going to go ahead and roll that back so we don't save things to the database. Then we have our employee DAO, which is essentially extending that DB connection. So we get all those connection things here. And I have a lot of gets here. And we have our first example. And this is where we're going to be using program code to essentially call two stored procedures that are doing those inserts. They don't have begin transaction within the procedures. We're doing it outside of the procedures, and we're doing it from within the program call. So we're coding the start transaction. We looked at the code that was in there. Then we can go ahead and prepare our stored procedure call, passing in all of the input parameters to our stored procedure. Then we're setting the strings. We want to return the employee ID. So we want to go ahead and register the out parameter. And then after we execute, we're going to get that out parameter value. So we're essentially passing that 16 in to get that value back. It should be there for us since we registered it. Then we're going to go ahead and if things are good and we didn't have any exceptions occur, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to call the SP insert employee territory. That's going to do that single insert. We're going to be passing in the employee ID and the territory ID and executing. Then committing that transaction. Otherwise, if we have some type of an exception that comes up, we're going to roll it back and then rethrow the transaction. Now, rethrowing the transaction, why would we do that? Because the data, if we're looking at the application, the data is usually at a lower level than our controller level that interacts with our view. So we need to bubble that exception up to that controller layer that can talk to our view. So that's why we are rethrowing it so that we can get that up to the higher levels. The second instance down here is we have our create employee, and this is going to be the one that calls that one that does the insert of the employee in the territory. So the all-inclusive. Notice we don't have any transaction we would be starting here. We're not committing any transaction. We're just essentially making the call and then closing the database, returning that employee ID. Why do we not need to start the database transaction and commit the transaction? Because that's being done in our stored procedure. Because if we go back to SQL Server, we can see right here, this is our procedure. We have our begin and we have our commit and our rollback. So that would be what happens. So that's giving you a quick look at how this works with program code, where we can call our stored procedures. Now, of course, there are mapping technologies that you can use as well, and we're just keeping it pretty simple and just using the JDBC version. You can do the ADO.NET. If you were doing something with C# that would be similar, or C++ as well, but we're just trying to keep it simple. We're not trying to get into mapping technologies, which takes the database level out of a lot of these things and kind of obscures the focus. In the next video, we'll take a look at some of the concurrency problems that could come into play.